Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Midgame, owner, director, organizer of the Los Angeles Chess Club, the most active club on the West Coast. We are in the midst of 2018 World Chess Championship match between reigning world champion Magnus Carlsen from Norway versus his first American challenger. He's actually Carlsen, who is actually the first challenger since 1972 match, Bobby Fischer. So tonight I'll be annotating game one of the match. Unlike typical matches of the World Championship games, that first few games they assess each other and they don't make any serious efforts to win, and they basically trying to evaluate each other and settings. Game one started very excitingly. So by the end of game one, everyone was hoping for a very exciting match this time around. So in the game, Carlsen was white, Magnus was black. The opening was Sicilian Rossolimo attack. To give a little background on openings, Carlsen opened with e4, and on move one of this match, we already have a surprise. Carlsen played Sicilian. Not that he hasn't played Sicilian before, he's never played it in the World Championship matches. So, as is the case, typically when your opponent plays certain very counter-attacking sharp line like Sicilian, you don't want to be caught off guard. Plus that, probably the reason Carlsen played c5 rather than an e5 was because he had found some flaws with the way Carlsen plays against e5. Maybe in his Roy Lopez variation, maybe in Italian, which Carlsen plays quite often. So already move one of game one is a surprise. So let's see how the game continued. Knight f3, knight c6. So far so good. And now the same surprise that Anand uncorked against Gelfand in their World Championship matches, namely Rossolimo variation, Carlsen did the same. So it's a good offbeat variation. There are several anti-Sicilian lines, like Rossolimo, like c3 variation, like close Sicilian, knight c3 on move 2. So these are all good anti-Sicilian lines. It's a question of which one you're best prepared. Thanks to the match between Anand and Gelfand, Rossolimo has become the main anti-Sicilian line. So there's a little bit more background on theory, and both sides come into this match prepared. So already we have a surprise. Not only it's Sicilian, but also Rossolimo variation. Carlsen showed in this first four games of the match, 3 times he opted for king fianchetto bishop, which is unusual. He usually doesn't do it. He's a very classical player, and classical players typically don't opt for king fianchetto variations. So another little bit of a surprise after only 3 moves. 3 surprises after 3 moves in game one of this match. Everyone was very excited. So white typically captures immediately on c6 in order to inflict some damage, whether black takes with a b pawn or d pawn on black's pawn structure. Of course, black usually captures with a d pawn in order to open this bishop diagonal also. d3. So after only 5 moves, we can do some evaluation. Typically, you want to do an assessment, evaluation of position after a pawn has been traded, pieces have been traded. That's a good time to assess the position and maybe to refine your plans. What can we say about this position? White has 1 pawn island, better pawn structure, no doubt, but black has the bishop pair. Having a bishop pair is a permanent advantage. We have temporary advantages in chess and permanent. I mean, there's no way white anytime soon can get rid of black's pair of bishops. So it's a permanent advantage that black enjoys for now. In exchange, white has caused damage with these double pawns. After d3, black played bishop g7. White played h3. Interesting move. Keep this move in mind at this point, because game 3 starts with the same exact position, except in game 3, Carlsen did not play h3. Black to play knight f6. White to play knight c3. Okay, so where is the outpost square for black in this position? Very good. Outpost should be occupied with pieces rather than pawns. And the most ideal piece is this knight. So who can tell me how black can move the knight from f6 to d4?
Give it a shot.
Ryan? It's very simple. You're spending too much time thinking. Can you move the knight from f6 to d4?
Not right away.
Well, I didn't say.
It doesn't have to be right away.
Here, that's the simplest way to do it.
Peter.
Okay, seriously though, black does want to bring the knight from f6 to d4. So that knight does come to e4 via d7, f6, e6, d4. Carlsen has done this plan many times in the past in exact positions with virtually win in every position. So, going with that plan, knight d7, and you say, wait a minute, aren't you supposed to castle in this position and not move the same piece twice in the opening? Yes, those are all good rules, good tips, principles to know, but there are exceptions in every situation. Black is not showing his hand which side of the board he wants to castle. And thanks to these two pawns, that strengthens the queen side. So he may want to consider castling queenside and not rushing with castling. Plus, when he castles, he has to move the rook to f8 and then go with this maneuver, and that will take a long time. While the king is still here, it'd be easier to play here, here, here. Yes?
And also, since the center is closed, it's not really that big of a deal to castle.
Actually, this is not a closed center. Definition of closed center is 4 pawns locked up. What kind of center is this? We have 5 types of pawn center. Closed, 4 pawns locked up, not the case. Open, no pawns at all in the 4 central squares, not the case. Fixed, just 2 pawns in front of each other with no pawns in the adjacent pawns, adjacent files, not the case. Mobile, somebody has 2 or 3 pawns, the other side doesn't. None of those. When it's none of these 4 famous types, it's unclear. So what we can say, despite the fact that it's unclear, we can say the center is stabilized. So stabilized usually comes up with locked up pawn center, and then you go on the wing attack. So at this point, one reason that I think Carlsen decided to opt for this position, you see in this position there are no pawn breaks, there are no surprises. And high-rated players, typically they like this kind of position because they can outplay their opponents that way. So white to play, we're in the opening phase of the game. After black played knight d7, white played bishop e3. So what's the point of bishop e3? Not only develops a piece, but also prevents black from playing knight f8. Now this pawn is hanging. So if black plays b6, which looks like a reasonable move, white could break in the center with d4, well protected now. And white will have, even though black gets rid of his double pawns, white will have better development. So first things first, you want to make sure white is not able to play d4. So what should black play?
E5.
e5 played. Excellent. There's always time for that plan later on. White to play. There are typical positions. In many of the positions here, white typically plays queen d2, castle long, because this bishop and this bishop often gets traded on h6, and white inflict damage in the center and on the king side against black. And that's perfectly good plan. As a matter of fact, most of the games that have been played has continued along that plan. Carlsen played a little bit different. Keep in mind, at this level, high level of championship, the only way you can surprise your opponent is not by tactics, because both are very well versed in tactics. It's through an opening novelty. And we know one of the strength of Carlsen in this match is his opening preparations. And of course, everybody knows Carlsen's strength is mid-game power play. So after castles, black wants to go with that maneuver. So he played b6. And now it's white to play. These pawns pointing towards the king's side. That indicates that white's strength is on the king's side. So there's a pawn break, very famous pawn break in such positions, and that's with f4. You notice in King's Indian defense where black has pawn on c7, d6, e5, the pawn break comes using f5. So that's typically the case. So white moved the knight to h2 with that plan. And black went on with his plan, knight f8. So each side is minding their own business, continuing with the plans. f4. Well, if black does not take, there's a good chance white will continue with f5, and white will have the upper hand, right? So black usually takes. Black takes, and now white to capture. Which one should he capture? Bishop or rook? In typical position like this, you play bishop takes. And after black plays knight e6, you move the bishop back here, and you'll be attacking along the half-open f-file. But Carlsen captured with the rook. This is a very interesting moment in the match. As a matter of fact, you would think, of course, you would think it doesn't make much of a difference. Had he captured with the bishop after knight e6, bishop here, and this would have been the position. But now that he captured with the rook, if black continues with this plan here, the rook goes to f2 this time. You see the difference? And of course, white will continue with, say, queen d2, rook a f1, and white would be better. So with rook f4, this is where Carlsen smelled rat. I mean, it's part of Carlsen's plan to play knight here, rook back, knight here. But had he done that, rook f2, knight here, queen here, let's say castles, rook a f1, white has a very good position. Next, he's going to continue with bishop here, 4 straight bishops, and this knight can jump in to these weak squares. And in the meantime, what can black do? What are his counterattacks? There's not much that black can do, and white pieces are all either on the king's side or close to jump in and get close to with this pawn sacrifice to the king's side. So this is the position that Carlsen did not feel comfortable. So in this position, after rook takes f4, black made an interesting and surprise decision. I was watching this game live, and most commentators, they said, knight e6, knight d4, black's plan is done, perfect. But Carlsen played bishop e6. Yes?
Queen's still on d1.
Queen still on d1, thank you very much. So black played bishop e6. So white moved the rook back to f2 anyway. And now the point of this continuation is to play h6. You see, if black continues with, say, knight d7, white will play bishop h6, and he's good. So this move has been played before. So far, these guys are following book lines. Nothing new yet. So white played queen d2. This move h6 in a way looks kind of weird, because you see black king is still stuck in the center. Not that white can prevent him from castling long, for example, or even short. But it looks a little bit weird, h6. But now Carlsen uncorked a novelty in this position. So between two strong players, especially in World Championship matches, the one who uncorks the novelty, usually he will have the upper hand. If not in the game, at least psychologically.
What was white's move after h6?
After black played h6, white played queen d2. Black to play. Let's see if you guys can guess black's novelty here. Just throwing some moves, whatever you think is best for black. A new move in this variation.
Queen F6.
Queen F6. Okay, it's a novelty, but a very bad one. We're looking for a good novelty. Definitely novelty. Yes. Okay.
D6.
In the interest of time, I'm hoping to cover this game in 40 minutes. G5. And engine's already turned into black's favor with this move. So Carlsen plan is interesting. What's the future of this knight? Not on d4 anymore, but through f4, maybe after g6 or even h4. A very interesting plan. White continued with his plan, developed his last undeveloped piece, and it's black to play queen d6. So black's strategy is to work on dark squares. Dark squares are already in black's control. And of course, light squares in white's control. Another point of queen d6 that black could castle long. White to play knight g4. Okay, so this is a little bit of a weak square in black's camp. And black could play knight d7, but this is a purely defensive move. And many masters may play this move also. But after knight d7, white can sit on this position, and maybe with the move e5 and knight e4, by sacrificing a pawn, his pieces will be swarming on the king side. So here Carlsen made an interesting decision. Castle long. So this is the moment that Caruana played the expected move, the natural move, knight f6. But here, many commentators thought that this would have been a fantastic pawn sacrifice for white in order to activate his pieces. If the queen retreats, knight e4, and knight comes to the attack. And if bishop takes, knight e4, he's got to keep the bishop guarded, so over here. And they felt like white has more than enough compensation here. He can even take here and knight f6. So this was an interesting moment that Carlsen, that white did not go for this pawn sacrifice because it looks kind of ambiguous. He played the expected move, knight f6. Nothing wrong with the move, by the way. Black to play. Carlsen's plan was to play knight g6 and work on these dark squares. Now he played knight d7, now that the white knight is already on f6. Of course, if white retreats, then black starts a beautiful attack on the king side. And we have opposite side castling. When there are opposite side castling, the number one rule is go have a pawn avalanche with your pawns. And black is already more successful in doing that. So on knight d7, white knight retreated to h5. Knight on the rim, sometimes it's not dim. Black to play, bishop e5.
It's definitely misplaced there.
Bishop e5?
No, the knight is.
Oh, the knight? Yes, but there's a point to knight h5, and you see it in white's next move. Of course, now if you look at this position, we say, wow. You notice black could have played here, forced trade bishops, and maybe even knight e5 next, but this square still would have been very weak. For now, black is holding the position to gain time to activate this rook on the king side and push. But look at these beautiful centralized bishops. So how would you assess their position? Whose position do you like? It's very difficult to assess this position correctly because each side has their strength and weaknesses. White's strength on the king side, thanks to this half-open f-file, is undisputable. On the other hand, black's pieces, beautiful bishops in the center, pair of bishop advantage for black, and virtually no weaknesses on the queen side. And these two extra pawns makes it difficult for white to have a pawn avalanche against his king. So that's what happened. And now Caruana felt like his position is difficult. the number one rule is make sure your opponent would not overwhelm you. So he played g4. For better or worse, he has to make this move, pushing pawns in front of your king, castle king. At this point, Carlsen had a huge time advantage. The time, Carlsen only had 24 minutes. This is move 19. He has to make 21 moves in 24 minutes. Of course, they have 30-second increment on each move. And Carlsen had 53. Huge time advantage, more than double by Carlsen. So, black to play f6. It's a nice move that guard holds everything. Now, you would think, where would be the more ideal square for this knight? On f5, right? And of course, these guys fully recognize that too. He should probably play knight here. One idea is to take. Another better idea is to play knight here, and the bishop takes, rook takes. But there's one problem with this move, which I'm sure crossed his mind. Carlsen will break through faster on the king side. Now if pawn takes, bishop takes, the position, white's position, king side, gets demolished. And if knight takes, there's a beautiful exchange sack, rook takes, pawn takes, bishop takes, and these pawns become very dangerous. So Caruana did not move the knight for now. He's having a serious, difficult position here. White to play b3. So he may at some point shift the knight to the king side, and he doesn't want to lose any of these pawns. So first he played b3. Black played bishop f7. So same problem as soon as this knight moves, whether it comes to g3 or g7, h5. So this knight, for better or worse, white cannot move it. He played knight d1. This knight was simply misplaced over here. So black to play. Black played knight f8. Going with the original plan. This knight did its work just fine as far as defending these squares, and now he's trying to shift to this side. But there seems to be a problem over there. There's a pawn sacrifice. It's interesting, very interesting, that black could have played bishop takes, pawn takes, instead opted to sacrifice a pawn. Because if the knight gets to this point, it'd be extremely powerful piece. And that is white's half of the board. You know, there's a saying among masters, if a knight comes to your side of the board, you must get rid of it, even with a rook, if you have to. Knight is the trickiest and most dangerous piece when it comes to your half of the board. So sure enough, Caruana went for it. There's nothing wrong with it. Knight takes pawn. So this is a purely positional pawn sacrifice. There's a difference between tactical and positional pawn sacrifices. In tactical pawn sacrifices, you often get your pawn back within a few moves or two or a few. In positional pawn sacrifices, you don't get your pawn back maybe at all, but you get a lot of position advantages. So here black played knight e6, and what a fantastic outpost to jump to next. And white moved the knight back to h5, exposing the bishop, and here, and also controlling this square one more time. So this is a good time for black to get rid of the knight now. Bishop takes, pawn takes, and then knight f4. Finally, Carlsen managed to bring the knight to a fantastic square. In this particular position, knight on f4 is much better than knight on d4. Knight on d4 just has nothing to attack, no target. But knight on f4, weak square, and he can get this pawn back if he needs to. So what should white do? Get rid of the knight, whatever it takes. Takes, black to capture. Pawn or the bishop?
Bishop.
Typically in this position, you do capture with the bishop. But Carlsen saw some benefits in opening the g file. You see this is extremely weak pawn, that's a weak pawn. So he took with a pawn. Of course, if white wanted to, he could give the exchange and play rook takes, bishop takes, queen takes, takes, but it's a little bit risky. He may lose this game. So he played it safe, rook g2, because he knows black is going to put a rook on the g file sooner or later. Yes?
Why not simply exchange? You already have an extra pawn, and then you get a pawn.
Right, it may not be enough though.
Need 2 points.
Yeah, that's a very subjective decision, but I think all the commentators agreed, and I agree too, that it's too early. Against someone like Carlsen, some of the players maybe you can survive, but against Carlsen it's very difficult to survive when you're exchanged down. So when this king becomes active, you can see that it's going to go after these pawns, and black has a rook for white knight, and that he may not be able to survive. So I think it's correct decision. So black to play, sure enough, put a rook on the g file, rook h8, and it's time to bring the pieces closer to the king side. Queen e2. So this is the outpost that white is hoping to put a knight via f2, f2, and g4. Queen e2. Sure enough, black took. Rook takes. Queen takes. And so king and queen in the same file. What does this suggest to you? Try to put a rook on e8, g8. So queen e6, just in time, knight f2, and after rook g8, knight g4. Can you tell who has the initiative? Who is calling the shots? Who is defending?
Black.
Black has the initiative, right. Black to play. Now he's got to work this out. White is, you could say, a little bit paralyzed in this position. So black strikes at white's weakest spot, h5, which is totally undefendable. Queen e8. White to play queen f3. First getting the queen off the dangerous file, then try to run like a chicken with the king. Queen takes h5. Starting here, engines started giving black decisive advantage. It's like 1 point so far, which is as good as a pawn. White to play, perfect time to run. King f2. I remember several commentators were criticizing this move, but I think Carlsen made absolutely the right decision. Plus, you notice that with the king off the file, this bishop is takeable now. Black to play, move the bishop back, bishop c7, and white played king e2. Again, they criticized him for this move, but I think he made the right decision. Black to play, queen g5. Okay, what could possibly be the point of this move?
H5.
The pawn is gonna run. White to play. One of the common things among masters is that when they see the knight is coming under attack with a pawn, they don't necessarily wait until last second, and when the knight comes under attack, then move it. They often do it one move in advance. We have many examples of people doing that. So white played knight h2 immediately. Black played h5 anyway. It's this pawn that saved the game for Carlsen, by the way. We'll see. White to play. Now he needs to work out a good defensive setup. Rook f2. Black to play. Black is going to strike at white's weakest spot. Where is white's weakest spot in this position?
Weakest spot, C2.
This area. He wants to penetrate with the queen, and Carlsen said, not today. Stopped him. Yes.
Was queen g7 maybe better?
Queen g7?
Or queen g7 now?
Yes. At 2 points during the game, queen g7 would have been better. Right now, and it's impossible to prevent it, queen g7 is one of the moves that seriously we're considering for black with advantage. After queen g1, knight f1, fh4. Obviously, Carlsen is pursuing a different plan. maybe with rook g3 at some point. So his instinct is absolutely correct. What let him down is somewhere else. Again, instead of h4, had he played queen g7, the engines would have given him 2.5 points. That is a win. This is would have been his biggest chance in the game that he missed. Instead, he played h4. Well, this was one moment. There's more. After h4, white played king d2. He kind of smelled red, and he figured, what if he does play queen g7 now? But no, it doesn't work because of c3. Prevents queen from coming in. Yes.
I looked at this position at chess.com, and someone suggested rook g3 here.
Yes. Here, black played king b7. This, in the middle of attack, of course you want to put your king to safety, but first of all, rook g3 was the winning move. And after takes, rook g2, queen here, I'm sorry, the king is still on e2. Queen c1, and white is clearly better. This is a winning position, the best that Carlsen had in this game, and he missed.
Who's clearly better? I mean, black.
Pardon me? Black is winning, right? So this is his best chance that he didn't do. Instead, now there's a totally unhuman move at this point. When white played king d2, the Stockfish, world champion computer, recommended e5. But keep in mind something else. At this point, move 37, Caruana, with 3 moves to go, he's got seconds. And at some point, he only had 6 seconds. Of course, with increment, with every move, you get 30 seconds. But at one point, he had 6 seconds. And in a situation like this, you don't want to make a move. This is totally wild. But this is exclam move, actually. And of course, by pushing this pawn, you notice this pawn becomes weak. And these checks. Carlsen saw this move, this amazing computer move that none of the commentators suggested. That's why he played king b7 now, guarding the c6 pawn. So white moved king d2, black moved king b7. And now the game has started to lose its pace a little bit. White plays c3. Even now, rook g3 would have been a winning move. Same plan. He must take. Because if he goes here, what's the move? Black to play. How about this? Oops, knight takes. On queen here,
You just take the h3 pawn.
yeah, you can take the h3 pawn, but after rook g2, things get really crazy. Oh, f3. Winning move. And if rook takes, rook g2, winning the queen. So this was the winning plan that Carlsen missed again. And I was watching this game live, and at some point Carlsen, with this continuation, would have been 2.85 ahead. So the engines, when they were evaluating this position, they said rook g3, 2.85 black. Instead, Carlsen played bishop e5, which is also an interesting plan. By no means it's a bad move. The idea is to strike at white's weakest spot. How can he attack this one more time? Queen g7. So played bishop e5, and white played king c2, and here rook g3 was still good, but he played queen g7. He went for the this is move 39. He's trying to take advantage of Carlsen's serious time pressure. So you can imagine such an exciting, wild game in the very first game of the World Championship match, which is typically quick draw, and everybody thought, wow, what a match we have this year. So white to play, there's nothing you can do about this pawn. So on king c2, he played knight h2, so he figured I have a nice square for my knight here. So sure enough, bishop takes, c3, and in exchange for this pawn that white lost, oh, I'm sorry, this queen is still over here. In exchange for this pawn that white lost, he won this pawn. Queen takes f4. So here black played bishop d4. And of course, if the rook moves away, say over here, how does he continue? Rook f8, drive the queen off this file. Instead, here white saw an opportunity to trade queens off. Carlsen put a nice resistance, and he figured he can have a draw. So played queen check. Of course, not takes, rook takes, because after check, king up, knight here, and white has created his outpost here. But instead, Carlsen played king a6, better move, and white quickly trade queens off. Queen takes, rook takes, and now he's got to watch out for his rook. Rook e2, and that means black rook can penetrate. So there's a saying in chess, rook behind pass pawns, whether yours or your opponent's. Because if it's yours, and as it advances, it gives more scope to your rook. If it's your opponent pass pawn, then you block it, you keep it from queening. So white did just that. After rook g3, white to play. His hope is to do something with this pawn. So play knight h4. Black figured he should be able to win this pawn and then go back and defend with the rook in front of the pawn. So play rook takes h3. And sure enough, e5, rook f3. Already, both sides felt like this could be a draw. And the engine is very close to equality now. e6, rook f8, e7, rook e8, just in time. The good thing for Carlsen is that this pawn is in dark square. So, and this bishop, the only bishop he has is dark square. In the meantime, he's got to watch out for this pawn too. All in all, the position already looks pretty drawish, but it's still a little bit tricky. White to play knight h6. Okay, what's the point of this move? Knight here, and he's going to win the rook. Black to play. With knight here, he's also attacking the pawn. So he played h3, and he's planning to play h2 next, and if rook takes, rook takes. So white defended the pawn with knight f5 and attacking the bishop too. White to play bishop f6. Had this pawn not been here, this would have been a winning position for white. Because he just chases the bishop, rook here, rook here, and he can't play rook takes because quickly pins it and wins it next. But with this pawn here, black has enough counterattack to win this pawn and give up this one. After bishop f6, the position is still a little bit tricky. Judith Polgar, one of the strongest women in the world, he came up with this move, rook e4. Very tricky move. What's the point of this move?
Rook a4 and knight d6.
Oh, check and then a fork.
If black goes on with his plan of sacrificing this pawn, all of a sudden, knight here. And if rook takes pawn, checkmate. Very interesting. But black can simply play b5 and fall White's plan on Rook e4. So White to play a3. I don't know Black noticed White's plan, but he played b5 anyway. And Caruana made a very interesting, great move. You see, one of the rules of bishop endings is that you want to have your pawns in squares opposite color of your opponent bishop, because it cannot harm them. But Caruana played b4, and that turns out to be an exclam in this position. That means this all 4 pawns against these 2 are pretty much paralyzed. You notice after b4, Black king has no moves. King b7 fails to knight check, and king b8 fails to knight d6. And if rook takes, knight check, winning the rook. So king has no moves to make. It's stuck here. So Black got rid of his one of his double pawns. C takes b4, a takes b4. And with the pawn on the 6, Black figured this is a good time to win this pawn finally. Of course, not rook takes, because rook takes, knight takes h2, and the pawn queens. But knight takes. And so here, Black played h2. White has to go after this pawn, which means there's no checks here right now. That means, I'm sorry, the rook is on e2. So after h2, rook takes, knight takes, and now we have a draw after all this exciting game. Why is it a draw? When there is 3-2 in rook endings all on one side of the board, it's a draw. If it's the same as 2 against 1, it's the same as 4 against 3. 4 against 3 is a little bit tricky. Capablanca won 2 of them. Very tricky. But most of the time, positions like this, extra pawn in rook endings, is a draw. So already engines were close, showing 0.05 or for White or Black.
How many more moves did they play?
Well,
Yeah,
right.
I know.
They played 55 moves so far, but they played on
60 more.
60 more moves.
Yeah.
So the rest really are not that exciting. I'll be really wasting your time. You can always go to chessgames.com and see the entire game. Chesslab.com, chessbase, many websites. But eventually, they agreed to a draw on move 115. They squeezed. Both sides were holding very nicely, very correctly, and
Why do you
neither.
think they kept on? Do you think that the extra pawn, he thought maybe I can figure something out?
Well, if I'm Black, obviously I'm not going to agree to a draw. I'm going to press on. If you have extra pawn, you try to. And Carlsen has proven to be a fantastic endgame player, despite his relatively young age. So Caruana was defending very carefully. Starting with king f2 and e2 and d2, he started playing good defensive game. So everybody was expecting Carlsen to come back in game 2 and act like angry birds and uncork a lot of things on Caruana, which we're going to see in the next hour, game 2. Hope you enjoyed it. Gracias.